The reality is this: real faith is grounded in the resurrection of Jesus Christ, and it is the result of new life and a new purpose and a new identity lived in and through Jesus Christ. Can everyone agree on that? Right? That when we talk about our faith and real faith in Jesus Christ, what we are really expressing is that faith has provided us a new life and a new identity in Jesus Christ. And in doing that, and in having that new identity, we are to walk and live in new ways. But it does not exclude us from trials, nor does it exclude us from temptations. Now, he opens the book of James, in James chapter 1, talking about our trials. And he says, whenever you are faced with many trials, divers temptations is what it's called in the King James. He says, count it all joy because you know that the trying of your faith works what? Patience. And if patience has its work in you, it develops you. It matures you. If you can allow that process to take place and still keep your faith in God. But here in verse 13 through 18, he really hones in a little bit more on the idea of temptation. You see, what he says is very clear, that when somebody is tempted, we should not say, God's tempting me, for God cannot be tempted of evil, neither does he tempt us with evil. Right? But we have to understand that we are the first fruits, and being in Jesus Christ, being born again through and in Jesus Christ, we are to be alive in Him, and our actions should show that forth, even when we are faced with difficulty, trial, and temptation. So, I want to start here because in dealing with this topic of temptation, it can at times, to be honest with you, be a touchy issue. But at other times, I find that here's where most people stand on the topic of temptation. Most people stand on the topic that we find it easier to look over at the other person and say, ooh, he's getting on them now. We have a tendency to overlook the issues of temptation that we have in our own life. In other words, we use filters in our own life to layer those things, to mask them, to dress them up, when the truth is we're being tempted, we're struggling with those temptations. We have a tendency to just dress them up a little bit prettier than we feel like other people do. Whether it is temptation or greed or gluttony or gossip, there's a list. And we'll come back and deal with those at some point. But the truth is, we all deal with things. There's two differences between us and them. One, we don't recognize ours as well as we do theirs, because the difference is we're better at filters than they are. Did you hear what I said? We're better at filters than they are. What I mean is, I referred to this last week, I believe, but we're like the Pharisees and the Sadducees when Jesus comes and preaches the Sermon on the Mount. And he talks about the issue of fasting, and he talks about the issue of giving, and he says, you got a problem with your giving. You do it with filters, you dress it up, so everybody thinks you're doing it for the right reasons, but I know your motives, and your motives are all wrong. And when you pray and use beautiful words, and you use beautiful filters, and everybody says, man, that's awesome, but I know your motives. Your motives are to impress everybody else with your prayers. You could care less whether you're submitting to me, connecting to me, or know my will. I mean, that's basically what he says in the Sermon on the Mount. He says, if your motives are wrong, I don't care how beautiful a filter you place on it. Let me give you a little illustration. If you're over the age of about 25 or 30, you'll probably know the name Paul Harvey. He's passed away now, but he was a news broadcaster, and he'd come on with a thought for the day type thing. And in that, one of those that he gave one time was this. He talked about Eskimos and how they dealt with wolves. And so here was the illustration that he gave. He said the Eskimo coats his knife blade with animal blood, and he allows it to freeze. He then adds layer upon layer of blood and ice until the frozen blood completely conceals the blade. The hunter then fixes the knife in the ground. He buries the handle in the ground with the blade sticking up, covered in blood and ice. A wolf will smell the blood, and then when he discovers it, he finds the bait and he begins licking the blood and ice. He can't bite the blood out of there, but he knows that if he licks that ice, that the ice will eventually melt and give way, and he can get to where that blood is. And if he can get to that blood, it'll get to the source of the meat that he's wanting. And so he will lick that blade and that ice, tasting the frozen blood as it begins to melt layer by layer. He licks faster, more and more vigorously, lapping the blade until the keen edge is bared. Feverishly licking the blood now, harder and harder, the wolf licks the blade in the Arctic night. And in his mad craving for blood, he does not recognize the razor-sharp sting of the naked blade, nor does he recognize the moment that his insatiable thirst for blood is being satisfied by his own warm blood. His carnivorous appetite just craves more and more blood until the dawn finds him dead, laying in the snow. Last week, I talked to you out of Genesis chapter 3 about another instrument of death. That illustration is very open and clear. The instrument of death was a knife blade covered in blood. But last week we talked about another instrument of death. It was a simple piece of fruit in the middle of a garden. Most people refer to it as an apple. But we're told that that tree grew that fruit and that it was the only forbidden fruit in the garden. Yet that apple became the same as that knife blade covered in blood. And in Genesis chapter 3, verse 6, the woman, Eve, saw the fruit. She saw that it was good. It was pleasing to the eye. It was good to eat. And in her carnivorous appetite, she did not understand or recognize that she was losing her own soul. Nor did Adam as he followed. Now, with that, you have to wonder every time you hear about another person who falls into temptation, who destroys their life, who may wreck their marriage, who may destroy and upend their job or their career. You have to wonder, why? Why does it happen? Let me just ask you, have you ever stopped and seen something like that happen and wondered to yourself, why? Why would you do that? Obviously we have. The reason we can ask that question when we see someone else is because we're looking at their situation without filters. But we've dressed ours up with filters and we make it look nice. And we don't recognize the danger in our own lives. We do not recognize oftentimes how close to that step we are. But we can recognize it easier in someone else's life. Yet we ask the question, why? I mean, why do we choose to validate and violate our values? Why do we voluntarily give up what we know could in the end perhaps be destruction? Why do we fly into such a situation that could cause us such harm? Yet we oftentimes find ourselves like flies or moths drawn to a flame or to a light that's going to sting it and electrocute it. We find ourselves doing the same thing. Understand that the Bible is a huge part of the reason that that like wolves that we talked about earlier, we have an enemy. And the Bible is a big part of explaining who that enemy is. And if we are going to deal with it, It's not the filters that we have to be aware of, and it's not even the instruments we have to be aware of. And one thing we have to understand is that we have an enemy out there, and he's staying up night and day trying to figure out ways that he can tempt us with bait that we simply find luring. And if we're not careful, we'll find ourselves on a day and a time when no one else is around, and we'll find ourselves sniffing that blood, that ice and blood-covered blade, seeking for something that will satisfy us only in the end for it to cause us more than we could ever imagine. In our text out of James, he tells us how temptation works, and he explains it to us so that through this we can understand and perhaps avoid some of those things. I need you to understand, just because temptation is dressed up with beautiful filters does not mean it's not dangerous. In fact, oftentimes the more it is dressed up, the more dangerous it is. And so he gives us a guide, short but concise guide. He says here in James chapter 1, and I want to go back over it, he builds here 4 steps that lead us down the road of temptation. He says, but each one is tempted when? By his own evil desire, or own evil lust, or own evil longings. He is dragged away and enticed. Now here's the catch. Some of you aren't going to believe me. But if you watch it long enough in other people's lives, and you watch it in your life, you'll find that I'm telling the exact truth. Most of the time, the thing that you see that is enticing somebody is simply a sidestep. What I mean by that is this. Most people that enter into immoral relationships, I'm just going to go to the heart of it. Most people that enter into immoral relationships are not looking for the things you think they're looking for. Somehow they're looking to satisfy a longing and a loneliness and a connection that they don't have. And it's dressed up in such an alluring package that they are willing to follow suit. And so what he says here is, but when one is tempted, but each one is tempted when by his own evil desires he is dragged away and enticed. I'm going to come back to that in a moment. Then after desire has conceived, it gives birth to sin. Catch that. After desire has conceived, then it gives birth to sin. And sin, when it is fully grown, gives birth to death. Right there, he gives you that simple 4-step process that leads from smelling that blood to licking that ice to leading to death. He says, number 1, the bait is dropped. That always involves deception, filters that are dressed up. Whenever you see, and the reason I'm preaching this is I need you to understand this, and I'll come back to it in a moment and explain it a little bit further. But whenever you see something dressed up, please understand it's using filters in your life. I don't care. I don't care if it's a relationship. I don't care if it's greed. I don't care if it's gossip. Most people that enter into gossip aren't looking to hurt anybody. They're just looking to make themselves feel better, make themselves feel more important, make themselves feel like they have it a little bit more together. And by talking about how somebody else doesn't have it together, it makes them feel like, well, I've got it together a little bit better. Can you believe what they did? Whenever you see something dressed up, you need to re-examine it, because when it's dressed up, it's usually simply bait that's been dropped. And that always involves filters of deception. Step 2, your inner desire is attracted to the bait. Step 3, sin occurs when we yield, when we bite the bait. The way James says it is that sin is, or after the desire has conceived, it gives birth to sin. Number 4, sin, when fully grown, gives birth to death. And notice, this path of death always begins with a bait being dropped. Now, the word that you see here when he says, but each one is tempted when by his own evil desires, he says, is dragged away and enticed. That word dragged away carries with it the idea of baiting a trap. The word enticed in the original Greek means to bait a hook. I talked about, I believe last week, the idea of fishermen going fishing. They don't carry worms with them just because they love worms. They need worms to do what? What? To disguise the hook, right? If you don't believe me, you go out to your favorite fishing spot. You take a fishing rod, you put a nice hook on it, you throw that hook out in the water with nothing on it. Tell me how long it'll take you to catch a fish. Why? Because most fish aren't enticed by metal hooks. But they are enticed by a cricket or by a worm squirming around, something that's moving in that water, and they think that's lunch. Same way, I know you may look at it and say, dumb fish. Have you ever thought that? I've seen guys throw a hook in the water, catch a fish, reel it in. Before they can hardly take the fish off the hook, they're throwing the rod back in, and another fish right beside it snapping on. You would think at some point, didn't you just see your buddy? Didn't you just see what happened to him? Yet it happens with us time and time again. We see people that are enticed by their desires. We see the road that it leads down, and yet we are enticed the same way. The idea of being dragged away and enticed here is simply the idea of a hook or a trap being baited. And he says that it is baited by our desires. Whatever your desire is, that's what it's baited with. And everybody has different desires. And I need you to understand, I'm not saying everybody here is a sinner this morning, but I can tell you, if you're living and breathing, you have desires. I don't mean to get personal, but it's true. Whether they are of a physical nature, whether they're of a financial nature, if they're of an emotional nature. There are some people that just want to matter in this world. They don't think about illicit things. It's not immoral things that drive them. They just want somebody to feel like they're important. And all of a sudden, somebody comes along and man says, man, you are awesome. You're great. Everybody has longings and desires in this life. And what he says is he doesn't get into specifics of what they are, but what he does describe here for us is he says when we're talking about temptation, he says what happened is when each one is tempted, they are tempted by their own desires, they are dragged away, they are enticed by a bait that's on a hook. And when you bite on that hook, what happens is sin gives birth. Or it gives birth to sin. And then when sin is fully grown, it gives birth to death in your life. That's the simple process of how temptation works. Time and time and time again, whatever label is put on it, in whatever arena or whatever format it happens in, that's the way it takes place. Because people aren't able to see the filters that are happening. Now, one thing that you will notice here, or two things that I want you to notice here, is that he does not mention Satan in this process. It's not that Satan is not involved. It's simply that his focal point is not Satan and his involvement. His focal point is the Christian and his walk. You see, he started out this chapter by talking about our trials. And when we go through those trials and the maturing of our faith, and now he deals when we go through temptations and deal with those temptations. He's talking about our reaction. The second thing I need you to recognize is sin does not enter the picture until when? Step 3. If you remember those 4 steps, the bait is dropped, the inner desire is attracted to the bait, but it's not until step 3 that sin occurs, and that is when we take the bait. So, if we can stop the process, because everybody's going to go through that process, you're going to be tempted sometime in your life with something. You have been tempted, and you're going to be tempted with stuff in your life. It may be something that you feel like you can hide from everybody else, but you're going to be tempted. You may find it easier to look over at somebody else and say, I'm not tempted with what they're dealing with. That may be true, but you've got issues that you are tempted with. And we have to stop it before step 3. And if we can stop it before step 3, we're okay. Because it's not a sin to have desires. It is a sin to act on those desires. To give in to them. To let them stay around. The truth is, you are human and you are flesh. There are going to be times, I'm just trying to be honest and real with you. Is that okay? I know at times you'd like your preacher to stand up here and say, if you pray enough, you're not going to have desires in this world. I'm just telling you, when I read Scripture, what I find is that as long as you have flesh and bone that's covering and containing your spirit and your soul, you're going to have desires in this world. It may be a desire for power. It may be a desire for attention. Whatever that desire is, you're going to have desires. But sin enters when you go to step 3. So how do we stop it before step 3? That was James's desire, is to explain it, and in the hope of explaining it, maybe he could have people stop. So let me talk about 5 steps or 5 things here that I think can help us deal with temptation in our life when we find ourselves with desires. And we know that it's dressed up, that there's filters that are dressed up for something that is far more evil. Number 1, I have to admit that I'm tempted. That's the first step. Until you admit that you're tempted, you can't deal with it. It's not good to pretend that you have not been affected in any way. You have to realize, and you have to be able to understand that you are. Listen, you're not a horrible person. It doesn't mean that you're a horrible person. If you're somebody that wants to make a little bit more money in your life, that doesn't mean you're a bad person. If you're a person that wants a little bit more attention in your life, it doesn't mean you're an evil person. If you want a little bit more influence and you want to climb the ladder of his success, it doesn't mean you're a bad person. Where sin enters is when we take the bait of doing something that breaks our moral code to accomplish our desire. As long as we can have that desire and trust God to develop it and develop us in His time, in His way. One of the simplest explanations that I can give you is those physical, whether it's those physical and emotional desires that you have that come as a part of being a man and a woman. It's not wrong. What is wrong is when we break God's path and go outside of the statutes and the structure that He set up for you to have that desire fulfilled. Everybody with me? It's not wrong for you to want to be more successful or to be more noticed or to have more influence. None of those things are wrong. The problem is when we break God's code and our code in accomplishing those things. So I need you to understand that the first step is to say, I have this desire. I have to recognize that I have this desire and that I am possibly tempted. Look at what Paul writes. Paul says this, but remember that the temptations that come into your life are no different than what others experience, he says. Don't spend time dumping shame on yourself. Instead, be aware of where you are tempted and realize how dangerous and destructive the trap can be. It's read out of the Message translation. But what he's saying is the first step is recognizing that you have issues here or there, that this is your weakness or that is your weakness, this is a temptation or this is a desire. You have to know it so that you can protect yourself from falling to it. Why do we need to be aware? Because the worst reaction that you can have to temptation is denial. Acting like, no, I'm too good for that. That's the worst trap that you can have in your life when it comes to that. So what is it that tempts you? I would say that you should admit it to yourself. That's the beginning. Be honest with yourself. Begin to pray over it. And find somebody that's a confidant that you can trust and talk to pray with you. Preferably a spouse, somebody that's going to be spiritual enough to sit down and say, hey, we're going to attack this thing and pray over it. Psalms 139 and 23 says, investigate my life, O God. Find out everything about me. Cross-examine and test me. Get a clear picture of what I am about. What he's saying is, God, I don't want there to be anything hidden. I don't want to layer it with filters. I don't want to present you this picture when in reality I'm this. Again, we're talking about those filters. Have you ever seen somebody on social media and think, man, they are attractive, and then you see them in person and you're like, you don't look like you do on social media. You know, right? Has that ever happened? We have those filters that are available, but we do that in real life as well. So that when we come to church on Sunday morning, I'm getting ready to. We act as mean as the devil at home Monday through Saturday. Our spouse and our children see us one way. On Sunday morning, we wash our face, we comb our hair, we even use a little bit of hairspray for those that use hairspray. We put on the suit, maybe a tie, we come into church, we act like we are we act like we are just Saint Raymond. Right? And that's because on Sundays we have gotten so bad, or so good, depending on the way you look at it, at dressing ourselves up and putting on filters so that people see us one way, and yet at home we're another way, and our children see both, and they have a hard time lining up what is reality. Right? The first step is admitting. And David said when he prayed to the Lord, he said, investigate me and know me inside and out. I don't want to be dressing myself up with filters. God, I want you to know me, and I want to know me. Secondly, I must then recognize that I am in a spiritual battle every day of my life. The first step is you have to understand what your desires are. And there's some of you that desire different things than other people. And I just want to say this. Your desire, I don't care how beautiful you've made your desire will lead you to hell just as quick as theirs will. You may look at theirs and say, that's shameful, that's disgusting. All I just need to tell you is that an apple will lead you to hell just as quick as a blood-covered knife will. You got me? And we have to recognize what our desires are. Secondly, no matter how beautiful and no matter how pleasant we dress it up and make it look, we have to realize that we're in a spiritual battle. I must know why I'm being tempted. Temptation has a very strong physical component to it. But at its foundation, it is a spiritual matter. Romans chapter 7 says, but there is another law at work within you that is at war with my mind. There is a battle going on. This law wins the fight and makes me a slave to the sin that is still within me. What he's saying is, although the battle may be taking place outside on the physical, and that's what everybody else sees, there is a really true spiritual battle taking place on the inside. And if we simply see that this is a physical battle, then we are prone to justify our actions. Ultimately, temptation is a trade off with God. It is saying, I need something, whatever your temptation is. I want you to hear me. This may be the most important statement I make this morning. Whatever you're being tempted with, really what you are saying is it's a trade-off. It is a substitute for what God says, I'll give you. Do you understand what I'm saying? Because what God says is, God says, I know your desires. But if you'll do it my way, and in my format, and according to my law, I'll bless you, I'll make you healthy, I'll make you fruitful, I'll bless you in years to come, I'll bring you peace and happiness. If you do it outside of that, eventually what it's going to bring you, you may reach your desire quicker, but what's going to happen is it's going to bring you death and destruction. So I have to understand here that it is a very spiritual battle. No matter what desire that I'm dealing with, it's a very spiritual battle. John 10:10 says, the thief's purpose is to steal and kill and destroy. My purpose is to give life in all its fullness. You understand the passage there? He says that what he's tempting you with, what he's dressing up there, the goal in him dressing that up is to destroy you. My goal, if you'll do it my way, is to give you life and peace and fulfillment that this world doesn't offer. So, when you're being tempted to cross the line, realize what's going on. Understand, number one, where you're tempted, but number two, understand that it is a spiritual battle. Number three, temptation is easier to avoid than it is to resist. Ooh, that's a good one. You hear what I just said? Can you say it with me? Now, let me take back what I just said. This may be the most important thing I've said. Temptation is easier to avoid than it is to resist. You see, temptation is something that when it comes into your life, the closer it gets to you, the more dangerous it is. Right? I've told you guys about me and Coke. To my knowledge, Coke hasn't done me a huge amount of harm. Coca-Cola. Let me clarify. We want to make sure we're all on the same page. Yeah. Thank you there. I appreciate that, Michaela. You just want to make sure we're all on the same page. Coca-Cola. The brown liquid that they sell in the bottle. You know what I'm talking about. Some of you are talking about, you were thinking, man, we don't know you at all. Yeah. No. I struggle with Coca-Cola, have all my life. And I don't want to rehash what I've told you before, but I'll go through cycles. I'll go through periods where I know I need to ratchet it back. It's not because it's caused me problems. It's just I know that if I continue, it will. And I'm in one of those phases right now that I've ratcheted it back. I'm drinking a good bit more water than I do Coke. And I try not to drink Coke with my meals unless it's a pizza. If it's pizza, I'm sorry, we're having Coke. Pizza's just not complete without a Coca-Cola. It's just, I don't know how people do it without a Coca-Cola. But I pull back on that. And right now I'm at a phase where I'm doing that. I've limited that. And I can tell you that it is much easier to avoid than it is to resist. One of my problems is I eat at a lot of fast food restaurants. In fact, I eat a lot in my car. You may find this surprising. You may do it. I don't know. But thank you very much. But about literally 60 to 75% at least. I think that's on the low side. 60 to 75% of my meals are eaten in the car. I know. Some of you are saying, you need to resist, Pastor, and you're right. But here's what I find, is that if I'm at a drive-thru, so much easier to say, give me a Coke with that, than it is to say, do you have any bottled water? Yeah, I know I'm paying more for the bottled water than I'm going to pay for Coke. Give me the bottled water instead. It's difficult for me to do that. And I can tell you, whatever it is you're dealing with in your life, I can simply tell you that temptation is easier to deal with when you can avoid it rather than resist it. I'm going to tell you a funny illustration, and I hope it's appropriate. But I can remember as a teenager my dad telling me on multiple occasions as I started to date and had my driver's license. And I honestly hope this is just not too forward and too crude, but I remember him telling me specifically on a few occasions, son, I know you're dating. I want you to understand that it is easier to make up your mind what you're willing to do and not do before you ever leave the house. You need to sit down, look in the mirror, and have that decision before you ever walk out the door. Because I'm going to tell you, if you wait to make that decision until you're sitting in the back seat of a car, chances are it's too late. And that's incredible advice to have. But I've carried that advice throughout my life. And what he was saying is, if you wait until the moment that you've got to resist it and fight it, you're in trouble. If you know where you're tempted, if you know what your desires are, and you can avoid it from becoming an issue in your life, that's the best step for you. I'm not saying you shouldn't resist it. I'm not making an excuse if you don't resist it. What I am saying is that if you really want to fight temptation in your life, the best thing you can do is avoid temptation. If you have a habit to gossip, you don't need to sit there politely. I'm just being honest with you. I don't think that's the time to be polite and sit there and listen to gossip, because then you're going to be tempted to share that gossip. If you are tempted to gossip and you hear somebody doing it, you need to cut it off and say, excuse me, I need to go. Why? Because if you can avoid hearing the gossip, you won't be tempted to carry the gossip on. Does that make sense? You may think, sitting here today, that I would never commit some of the acts that I see other people do. That's denial. That's the most dangerous way to deal with temptation. You can look at other people and say, I've seen what they've done. I've heard, did you hear what so-and-so did? Did you hear this or did you hear that? That is the most immature spiritual thing you can do as a Christian and a child of God. Because what you're doing is denying that you could fall prey to the same thing. I'm sure that King David, the king of Israel, felt that way too. In 2 Samuel chapter 11. It's when David is king of Israel, and the Bible describes him as a man after God's own heart. That's the way the Bible describes him. And one day when he's on the roof of his palace, he sees something, and instead of avoiding it, he tried to resist it, and it took the best of him. I'm just telling you that the best, easiest, safest way to deal with temptation is to run from it. These things don't just happen. 1 Corinthians chapter 15. 1 Corinthians chapter 15. If I can get there. Give me 1 second. I've lost my place. Don't you like when that happens on a tablet? 1 Corinthians chapter 15. Some say, let's cease and get drunk, for tomorrow we die. He says, don't be fooled by those who say such things. For bad company corrupts good character. What he's saying is that the company that I keep is going to lead me down the path that I'm going to follow. Number 4, once you recognize your desires and you try to avoid them, the 4th thing that I would say is focus on God, not the temptation. So 1, admit what I'm tempted in or have desires for. Secondly, recognize that it's a spiritual battle. 3rd, understand that temptation is easier to avoid than it is to resist. Number 4, focus on God, not the temptation. What I mean by that is you don't ignore it, you don't overlook it, you don't act like it doesn't exist. What you choose to do is say, if I'm tempted by this, and God says, I need you to go this way, I need to place all my focus on God. 2 Timothy 2:22. Turn your back on lustful thoughts and give your positive attention to goodness, integrity, love, and peace. It's not enough just to flee temptation. Temptation will eventually catch up with you and tempt you again. If I say, don't think about a pink elephant and a white tutu, what's everybody thinking about right now? You're envisioning a pink elephant in a white tutu. Right? It's the way temptation works. It's not enough just to try to not think about temptation. You need to be able to focus on something that's going to provide you life and going to be your substance. The key importance there is so that we focus on God, not our temptation. Number 5, and I'm going to stop. Number 5 is simple. You need to choose to stop. Some of you this morning, while I'm talking about this, you're disappointed in yourself. More than likely, you're thinking things that you're dealing with right now. You may be thinking about things that you've dealt with in the past. The goal of this sermon is not to get you to feel bad or to be down. The goal is that if you are struggling with desire and temptation, my goal today is to get you to stop at step 2. Because step 3 is where sin enters. And if sin enters, and you allow sin to have its rule and reign in your life, it will lead to step 4, which is death. Spiritual death. And so you can focus on God, but you can still follow the path of temptation. So all I'm trying to tell you is you need to avoid temptation. You need to focus on God. And you just need to stop. It's that simple. Don't say, well, I might be struggling with this temptation, but look at what they're dealing with. It's not as bad as what they're dealing with. Well, I might be a little bit greedy, but, they're dealing with sexual immorality. I might like to gossip a little bit, but I ain't killed nobody. Truth is, if you're a gossip, you've probably killed more people than you think you have. The last step is to simply stop. Stop making excuses. Stop allowing yourself to be led by your own desires. Follow God's desires and God's plan and God's path. All I'm trying to do this morning is pull the filters off. And when I pull the filters off and I read God's Word, what He says is if I do it by His plan, He'll lead me to peace, to prosperity, to blessing, to happiness, to fulfillment, to eternity in heaven. That's His path.